Hello, EHS friends. Welcome back. This is Zud. In the last episode, we finished talking about hazard identification, and today we're moving on to next step, risk assessment. All right, before we jump in, let's first take a look at what the risk really means. In the GPT 45001, risk is defined as a combination of the likelihood of occurrence of a work-related hazardous events or exposures and the severity of injury and ill health that can be caused by the events or exposures. So in other words, risk comes down into two things. The first one is likelihood, how likely an accident is to happen. And the second one is severity, how serious a consequence could be. In practice, risk usually comes up as questions like, what's the safety risk here? So when someone asks that, they really want to know not just the consequence, but how bad it would be and how likely it is to happen. For example, if you ask, what's a safety risk in painting? And someone might say, it has the risk of explosion. Explosion is a consequence, but actually it also tells you the severity because explosion usually involves multiple fatalities, so you don't need to explain much, people get it right away. But that's only half of the picture. We also need to look at the likelihood. Is it low, medium, or high? So let's say the likelihood of an explosion during painting is relatively low. And then when you put those two together, the severity and the likelihood, you can determine the overall risk level. So in this case, we can say the risk of the risk of explosion during painting would be considered high. Now, how do we assess risk? The first approach is direct determination, which means that we can decide the risk level straight away based on certain criteria. There's no calculations needed. And in most cases, those risks can be directly classified as high risk because we usually level risks up rather than level them down. The criteria we use for direct determination include, first of all, OHS laws and regulations. Many local governments publish official lists of high-risk hazards. For example, Jiangsu province has released a catalog of high safety risk and extremely high safety risk. So if it appears on that list, it's considered the high level risk. The second criterion is the internal health and safety targets. For example, say your company had 10 finger crushing accidents happened involving a specific machine, and the management really wants to bring the number down. So this finger crushing hazard can be directly classified as a high risk. The next thing we should consider is audit findings. For example, if a serious nonconformity is identified during an external audit, the associated hazard can be considered a high risk. But sometimes it's not just that the risk itself is high, it's just because that the issue has been around for a long time and hasn't been systematically fixed. So when the auditor they find it, they would flag it as a serious nonconformity. And it requires companies to give it more attention. The last criterion is complaints from interested parties, such as customers' complaints and employees' complaints. And any hazards related to those complaints can be directly classified as high risk. And again, it doesn't always mean that the actual risk is very high. It's just that those hazards can have a big impact on the company. And the management, they really want them fixed, regardless of the true risk level. For all of those cases, there's no need to apply a formal risk assessment method. We can just directly label them as high risk or extremely high risk And for everything else, we can use different risk assessment tools or methods to work out their risk levels. You will see a variety of recommended methods in the risk assessment guidelines issued by different provinces. And the most common one is LEC method, which is widely used in China. And this method looks at three factors: the likelihood of an accident, and exposure, which is how frequently people are exposed to the hazard. And the third one is the severity of the consequence. And each factor is given a score, and then you multiply the three scores together to get a risk value. And based on that risk value, you can determine the risk level. Another common method is called LS, or risk assessment matrix, which is more widely used internationally. And this one is similar to LEC, except that it doesn't include exposure frequency. It only looks at two factors, the likelihood and severity. And again, you multiply the scores for each factor to determine the overall risk level. We'll dive deeper into these two methods in the next episode and walk through how these two methods actually work in practice. Okay, that's it for today. Thanks for listening. And if you are interested in learning English, please scan this code and join our group. I'll catch you in the next episode.